what this slide is supposed to illustrate is how much the world has changed over the last 10 years. And just by way of background, before I went into private practice and eventually joined Latham, I was at the European Commission in the Director General for Competition. And back in the early 2000s, and that's the blue piece on the chart here, I was in policy and helped write various guidelines on technology transfer agreements and abuse of dominance and so on. And essentially, the framework that we used was a very old industrial world framework of the traditional vertical value chain, where you make a product, you basically push it down the chain to your distributors, they sell it, and all the money is made, in a sense, selling that product. And services and so on are typically an afterthought. It's something that you provide because you have to, but the main business is selling the product. And what has happened over the last 5 years in particular is that everything is going digital, and that is really fundamentally transforming the business world in a way that products matter much less, services matter a lot, and more of the money that is made is somehow linked to using data. And that basically means that the whole world of antitrust needs to reinvent itself, because all those rules that we created back in the early 2000s were based on a very different vision of the world. So we are having to struggle as antitrust lawyers with digitization and what that does to the economy, and also what that does to antitrust law, because antitrust law is really about business and how markets work.
So it actually reminds me of Giles's, for those of you here this morning, connected cows, in that, what is the value in the next 5 years in farming, right? Is it the cow, is it the beef, or is it actually the information about how to improve the processes? And I think we're moving further and further, both in sort of traditional heavy industry, agriculture, businesses that were never really data businesses are all becoming data businesses. And that sort of brings us on to the next slide. I stood up at our partners conference probably about 5 or 6 years ago now on a very big stage with a rather difficult audience, and told them that I believe that data was currency, and that in 10 years' time, we'd be talking about data as currency. And I think in the antitrust arena, that's quite interesting, because a lot of the antitrust tests are based around revenue, and we now end up in a world where you can take a business idea to market very, very quickly. You can collect an enormous amount of data. You don't even need to, you use a cloud, you don't need your own IT system, you don't really need your own people. They talk about the sort of one-person, billion market cap company. What does that do to a revenue-based test? And you look at all these different things converging. Where are the antitrust regulators in sort of grappling with that?
We're just at the beginning, essentially, of grappling with that. Because both lawyers and economists, they like rules and models. And when you've applied a certain set of rules and models for decades, it takes a bit of time to get your head around that you need to think about competition law issues in a different way. And particularly, you need to understand what drives the new models, how data is important to that. And as always, it's a good starting point to keep your eye on the money. Where's the money made in these models? And even if it's more and more services that drive the monetization, part of these services are free. The Google model with search, it's free. Money is made selling advertising. And competition authorities are struggling greatly with how you deal with these free services that can be the centerpiece of a business model. So we're really only at the early stages. And I think that's also why you see a case like the FCO case in Germany, because once you have these disruptive moments in an area of law, as we're having now in antitrust, you will see a lot more experimentation. People will say, hey, what should the rules look like? And different authorities will try different things.
And what about just at the bottom right-hand corner, this concept, this is a word that I learned last year from your team, of co-opetition. As I understand it, the traditional competitors now have to cooperate, because otherwise these platforms won't work.
And
it is a word, right?
It is definitely a word, and it's actually been around for a while, but it's gaining importance because, as you said, there are more and more areas where traditional competitors need to cooperate to make something work. So take autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. All of a sudden, an industry that hasn't changed pretty much since the Model T is now changing, or will change radically in the next 5 to 10 years. But in order for these autonomous vehicle systems to really get off the ground, you need to have many, many different companies collaborating to create the infrastructure. You need to have a lot of exchanges of data between them because otherwise it doesn't work. So traditional competitors like BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, just to mention a few, will start cooperating closely to get these systems to work. And from a competition authority perspective, it's a challenge when you have competitors that at the same time are partners. They need to exchange a lot of information. Typically that can raise issues about, well, if I know everything about you, what does that mean for competition? So as an antitrust matter, there's been a lot of focus for a long time on how information flows. And typically the approach has been pretty restrictive. The authorities don't like to see a lot of information flowing. But as we go into this new world of co-opetition, you will necessarily need to have a massive amount of data flowing between all the different participants in these ecosystems, including competitors. And we just need to accept that that's the new world. But we also need to draw new lines in the sand when it just gets to be too much. And that's an area that I think will develop again pretty massively over the next 5 years or so.